The council chamber folded open like the gills of a sleeping leviathan, as the capsule slid into the chamber's gravity well and settled on the dais beneath the central skylight. Light spilled in through a dome of honeyed glass, refracting into 1,000 halos that stitched the chamber into a mosaic of stars and ice. The walls, once dull with the weight of centuries of political maneuvering, shimmered with living pigment that shifted as if the room itself breathed. The floor bore the soft tremor of 100 quiet whispers, the rustle of robes, the measured hiss of air as the chamber prepared to witness a moment that would be remembered across galaxies. From the edge of the dais, a figure rose that did not so much stride as carve his presence into the room. He stood tall and broad, the outline of a warrior of a species long used to dominating the field and the council alike. He wore armor that looked as much ceremonial as functional, plates that glowed faintly with a crimson ember of power. The air around him seemed to thicken with a perfume of ozone and old iron. His eyes, sharp and calculating, swept across the assembled beings and found them not merely as subjects of concern, but as pieces on a board he could tilt with a single thought. The name that traveled the chamber before he did, Kethvar, brought a practiced hush, a polite caution that barely masked arcane hunger. He did not storm the room with noise. He unfolded it as one unfolds a map, careful, deliberate, and deadly in its intent. He had come as a conqueror might come to the court of old, except this court was a living engine of membership from 100 worlds, each a different breath of the cosmos, each carrying a different fear that would become a weapon in the hands of someone who understood fear's many faces. Kethvar's entrance was not merely a symbolic gesture of power. It was a statement about his estimation of the others, particularly the tiny, supposedly fragile human delegates who had earned a reputation that preceded them like a rumor that could bruise a star with its weight. The humans, so the legends warned and the sentient traffic of the council agreed upon with a common, reluctant trembling, were said to turn the momentum of a battle with nothing but ignorance of their own limits. They were described as primitive in a way that always seemed to be a misnomer burdened by fear, not by fact. The word trembled on many tongues, a note of scorn wrapped in a handshake and offered with a smile that never reached the eyes. Kethvar did not begin with a speech. He began with a study, a patient gaze that measured the distance between himself and those before him, as if to decide how easily he could erase the distance with a single choice. The Zephyrians, insects in elegant motion with wings that reminded many in the chamber of living rain on a window of ice, clicked their mandibles in a rhythm that suggested a chorus of tiny alarms, a chorus that could pivot from curiosity to alarm to anger in the time it takes a nerve to fire one impulse. The Vortani, crystalline beings whose bodies resembled shards of light imprisoned in perfect geometry, glimmered in their seats with a patience that felt both captivating and terrifying. The Nautari, an aquatic people whose bodies shimmered like the surface of a deep-edged pool, spectral, reflective, and capable of bending water as if it were a second skin, held themselves with the control of tides determined not to betray the mood of a storm they could sense in the room's murmuration. Kethvar raised a hand, and the chamber settled into a careful silence that tasted of metal and old ozone. "I am Kethvar," he announced, voice not loud but carrying like a hammer's careful measured blow. "Warlord of the Raxor clans, conqueror of sectors that have learned to count the breaths before they count the stars. I come as a guest with a grant of authority. I leave with a decision that will shape the future of your galaxy." He paused, letting the weight of his own words fall like a stone into a still pond. "I have observed your Federation's rituals, your parade of etiquette and proposition. I have watched as you declare your laws and then bend them with the speed of a blade through cloth. I do not come to condemn you. I come to test you." A ripple ran through the room, the kind of ripple that begins as a tremor in a glass dome and becomes a wave in the bones of the building when a storm is brewing in the outside world. The insect voices of the Zephyrians hummed and clicked as if a chorus of telegrams had begun to buzz through the air. The Vortani's facets captured and refracted the light into 1,000 small prisms that hovered momentarily, as if they were considering a secret answer that could only be given if the question was approached from the right angle. The Nautari's bodies relaxed and wavered, as if sensing a current of the sea that might sweep them into an unfamiliar horizon. Kethvar's gaze shifted to the human delegation, a line of beings that looked at him neither with fear nor with the naive brightness of youth, but with a measured, calculating calm that held a quiet tension beneath the surface. The chief human envoy, an elder maneuverer of diplomacy named Serendihal, sat with the posture of someone who had learned to ride storms rather than avoid them. His eyes, pale and piercing, reflected not bravado but a patient readiness to listen for the truth behind the bravado. Beside him, a younger translator named Lyrakest, whose voice carried both warmth and a sharp edge, warmed the room with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. A smile that could calm a child and drive a dagger into a traitor at the same instant. Kethvar did not miss the human delegation's assemblage of talent and restraint. He had studied humans as he studied every new subject that fell into his orbit, but he had not yet faced a living, breathing planet of them, a species that had survived in unrelenting proximity to predators greater than themselves, and then turned that proximity into a weapon of cunning, a weapon of social and strategic psychology. He expected a certain crude bravado, a show of force, perhaps some backslapping ceremony of ritual power. He did not expect the human restraint to be the first weapon laid on the table. The chair of the Galactic Council, the oldest, most patient of the sentient beings who presided over the assembly, a being named Elira, whose form was an old tree grown into the shape of a judge, lifted a hand to bring the chamber to order. The climate of the room shifted to an even colder calm, as if every world's air agreed to shrink to a more precise temperature, so the truth could be seen with greater clarity. The chair's voice, a deep, resonant tone that carried through the chamber's acoustically engineered space, spoke with a tone that could be both a caress and a verdict. Warlord Kethvar, you have entered the hall with a question for the entire living galaxy. You say you wish to test us. You will be given a demonstration of your choice, and the consequences will fall on your own people as surely as they fall on us. We remind you that this council is not a battlefield. It is a forum for survival. You claim to seek our consent to a future that will include your victory or your ruin. It is not the future that concerns us as much as the means we choose to use to navigate it. Kethvar inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the chair's subtle power. He did not flinch at the wording. Instead, he allowed the moment to stretch, the chamber's silence filling the space between his words and the next action. He spoke at length, not in a speech, but in a calculated progression of declarations and questions, each one designed to reveal an asymmetry in the humans' defense, a soft point they had not anticipated because it lay not in their weapons but in their psychology. I call for a trial, he said, letting the words fall like an anchor. Not of your armies or your ships, but of your minds. If you pass, your galaxy will have earned a seat at the council on equal terms with the rest of us. If you fail, you will have proven that your history of survival has been achieved through luck and the willingness to learn from the wrong enemies. He allowed a slow, courteous smile to crease his features, the kind of smile that promised a different future only to reveal an unspoken threat underneath. Choose a scenario of your own making, he instructed, though his eyes hinted at the parameters of a scenario that would be both a demonstration and a trap. The humans exchanged glances, the kind of exchange that takes place in a silent film among a dozen languages, an art of lips and nods and micro-expressions that say more than speech. Serendihal finally spoke, a line of words that carried a weight of decades and the quiet fear of a species that had learned to rely on their own minds more than on their numbers or their weaponry. We will propose a game of adaptation, not of annihilation. His tone was not defiant. It was deliberate and weary, the tone of someone who has watched civilizations rise and fall under the same heavy wheel of ambition. We propose a field test in a controlled environment, an arena of challenges that are not physical in their first sense but psychological and strategic. We will present a scenario that requires rapid, creative improvisation across 100 degrees of unknown variables. We expect you to either accept a challenge designed to reveal flaws or to permit the council to appoint a neutral magistrate who will determine whether your test would be fair. A murmur rose from the Zephyrians, who had their own traditions about ritual challenges, where the smallest miscalculation could destabilize a world. The Zephyrians, with their delicate wings that could be used to sense electromagnetic fields, whispered to one another in a language of wingbeats and tiny chimes. The Vortani created a soft, crystalline resonance that spread across the chamber like the shimmer of a winter's aurora. Their voices, when they spoke, sounded like shards of ice striking a surface. The Nautari moved in their watery bodies with the grace of something born of tide pools and deep trenches, their eyes like glass beads that reflected every possible fear and possibility. In the room's collective memory of wars and tests and treaties, a single thread began to pull itself taut. Humans had always preferred to be tested by necessity rather than by intention, to be forced to improvise when order collapsed. The thought settled in the minds of the council members as a choice crystallized, a test of human resilience, cunning, and control over narrative. The humans, who had always navigated the climate of suspicion with a patient quiet, now faced a test designed not to punish but to reveal. Kethvar's voice was a measured instrument. "Very well," he said. "I accept your demonstration. I will present the field test and observe the results. But I insist that the test be rigorous, that it challenge not only your people but your assumptions about power itself. You will be given a scenario in which your world stands on a precipice, and only your best instincts will keep it upright. It will be a test that requires cooperation among diverse species, a task that cannot be solved by linear force, but only by networked minds and resilient systems. You will have a week to prepare your entry." A week. The word rolled through the chamber with the heaviness of rain gathering on a roof. In the old days, such a time would be enough for a warlord's spies to descend and discover the city of a rival. Now it would be enough for the human minds to weave a plan that could matter across entire galaxies. The humans would not be allowed to send soldiers, not initially. Instead, they would have to rely on science, diplomacy, and the cunning of a species that had learned to survive in the shadows of larger predatory civilizations. The phrase "a week" had an odd gravity in the room. The participants knew, in their bones, that a week could be longer than a battle's duration if the battle was a mind's game, a struggle for the galaxy's future that would be settled in decision and perception rather than in fire. The Council's decision bore upon them as if a long, slow storm were edging its way across their minds. A storm that would not end once the rain started, but would continue to fall in the form of new possibilities. The human delegation rose with a quiet precision that suggested the best kind of discipline. Not the loud and triumphant display of a victorious army, but the controlled, careful stance of those who have learned to win by not appearing to win, to negotiate a future by being the last to admit that a decision had already been made in the other party's mind. Saren Dehal's eyes met Kethvar's with a look that was not fear but a strange kind of curiosity, the curiosity that follows a dangerous, shimmering light across a floor of ice. He inclined his head in a gesture that could either be an oath or a warning, and then spoke again, his voice steady but carrying a weight that the chamber could not ignore. "The field test will be proposed in the form of a living, observable experiment," Saren said. "You will observe from a distance and will not interfere unless the integrity of the test is threatened. If you can accept this governance for your own purposes, then you will see that our species is capable of more than brute force or rapid cunning. You will see that we can create a system in which cooperation among divergent minds becomes the instrument of survival rather than the instrument of fear." Kethvar's lips quirked in an almost chiseled smile, the kind of smile that promised a challenge and an answer at once. "We will observe your test," he said, "and we will adapt. If your species can survive the unknown without dissolving into chaos, then you may have earned your place on the Council on more equal terms. If not, I will determine what your fate will be." The room's tense quiet thickened, like a fog that has learned to cling to every surface. The Zephyrians chirped in a chorus that resembled a high, bright wind, a sound that could lift a leaf off a branch and then fall away into the quiet of breath. The Vortani's crystal bodies refracted a spectrum of colors and then paused, as if listening to a distant signal. The Nautari's mouths opened for a moment, releasing a soft, buoyant sigh as their bodies glided closer to the water-like barrier that separated the chamber from the world outside. It was a moment of fragile alliance and fragile anticipation, a moment that would set the tone for the days and nights to come. Kethvar's departure from the dais carried the weight of a man who had chosen to walk into a field of spikes with his eyes closed, and a grin that was not a grin at all but a calculation. When he finally moved, it was with the swift, decisive motion of someone who knew that the real test would come not from what he could do to others, but from what he could do to himself. How much he could endure, how much control he could retain, and how much he could predict about the reactions of beings who had, in their own way, learned to live with the weight of the universe on their shoulders. The chamber's doors closed behind him with a soft sigh of ancient machinery. The council remained, a constellation of living beings suspended in a single moment of time, the air between them charged with the possibility that a single decision could rewrite the future of more than a dozen worlds. They looked at one another with wary eyes and careful lips, the kind of faces that knew how to speak without words because words could be used to cut or to confuse. They did not yet know what would come next, only that the play had begun, and their world was a stage on which an unknown species could become the sole focus of everyone's fear and awe. In the days that followed, the city ships around the chamber's orbit hummed with the rumor of the test. The humans did not hide. They prepared in the open, a choice that was both bold and prudent, given the history of interventions in the minds of young, ambitious civilizations. They began with a council of engineers, psychologists, linguists, and tacticians who were used to working together under pressure. A team assembled like a chorus of specialists who would sing a single, dangerous note when asked. The human delegation did not boast of their capabilities. They proposed methods, a plan in which their strengths would become the instrument of the test rather than a tool of possession. The Zephyrians, for their part, did not rely solely on their winged bodies or their curious sense of turbulence to sense the environment's hidden variables. They spoke in a language of tactile signals, of wing beats that tuned themselves to the microcurrents in a given space. They spoke in a pattern that suggested a calculation of probability on a scale that would make a human mathematician's head spin. They told stories of their own encounters with humans, stories that contained both awe and dread, stories in which the humans had manipulated the battlefield of perception with surgical precision. A Zephyrian elder who had seen more battles than most of his kin spoke in a whisper that could have been a breeze or a leaf falling on a quiet night. He told of an invasion that had started not with a charge, but with a rumor that traveled through social networks of the minor worlds, and grew into a fear that forced enemy commanders to pull their fleets from their planned routes. The rumor changed the enemy's perception of their own power, not by a direct confrontation, but by the belief that their own world would be swallowed by a force they could not see until the moment of contact. The humans had engineered that rumor to cause panic, and then used the panic to slip into a position of advantage without firing a single shot. The elder's voice trembled with the memory of the moment when the enemy's carriers drifted away from the planet's orbit, and the human force appeared in a way that felt like a shadow over a noonday sun. The Vortani, for their part, described a different kind of encounter, one in which a human team had entered a prison of crystal that held political dissidents of several species. The humans did not attempt to break the crystalline walls with brute force. Instead, they used a device that could resonate with the lattice's vibrational frequencies and coax the prisoners to cooperate with their own captors, turning an apparently hopeless scenario into a negotiation that avoided a bloodbath. The Vortani told of a moment when their own guards confessed that the humans' mind games had gains that mathematics could scarcely predict, gains that could not be measured in the currency of force, but in the currency of trust created in the space of a few minutes. The Nautari spoke of the sea that existed between a world's achingly bright surface and its dark, cold core. In one instance, they explained, humans had entered their world not with a torpedo or a weapon, but with a parasite of a different kind, a cultural assumption about their enemy's fear, and then a patient, precise approach to deconstructing that fear with stories, songs, and shared rituals that slowly eroded the fear's power. The Nautari described watching as a group of humans, instead of contacting them with violence, contacted them with a ritual that resembled a treaty in breath and ripple, a treaty that asked the Nautari to lay down some of their most ancient defenses and let the humans walk into a space of mutual vulnerability. The fear that had once glowed on their faces had become something that could be negotiated, and the humans remained in the room long enough to show that trust could be built on a delicate, even dangerous, terrain. In the days that followed, the humans did not reveal all their hands at once. They released a sequence of demonstrations not in the form of weapons, but in the form of options. They built a demonstration of a shared future, in which multiple species could co-manage a critical resource without fear of collapse. They showed a map of possible outcomes that did not revolve around conquest, but about adaptation and resilience. The council watched, the room's air thick with a mixture of fear and wonder, as the humans demonstrated the ability to coordinate across a spectrum of lives and needs, a capability that suggested a kind of social technology as powerful as any weapon. Kethvar, watching from a distance as the test's outline formed in the minds of the council and their guests, felt something stir within him that he would later come to name regret. It was not a fear of losing the game. It was the dawning recognition of a possibility that his own people might misread the entire environment if they trusted too much in brute force, and in a single kind of cunning. He allowed himself the strange act of listening to the room's quiet conversations, to the way every species spoke not just with words but with the physics and biology of their bodies, to the way the humans did not plead for mercy, but prepared to negotiate the future with their enemies as participants in the same problem rather than as enemies to be crushed. As the week's end neared, a set of incidents, each a spark that could have become a wildfire, began to drift into the council's common memory. The Zephyrians recounted the moment when an agricultural world faced a blight of unknown origin. The humans had not brought a cure. They had brought a protocol for rapidly testing and isolating variables in the field, a chain of steps that could be implemented by farmers and technicians working in environments that would have made any external force retreat in shame. The Zephyrians explained that, within 3 days, what would have taken centuries of pest control had been accomplished by a series of small, precise actions, each one a move in a chess game where the human mind had become a silent engine of problem-solving. The Vortani shared a memory of a political crisis that threatened to fracture an alliance of worlds with a single, terrible misinterpretation of another species' intent. The humans did not force a vote or impose a solution. They orchestrated a deliberate, transparent negotiation where each side could observe the other's fears and the logic by which fear could be transformed into trust. The environment's crystalline geometry, the prison of the Vortani's own design, was then used as a demonstration of how trust could bend even rigid logic into a new stability. The humans' plan did not erase old wounds, but gave space for new ones to be reconciled, and in that reconciliation, for new powers to emerge that did not rely on the old vocabulary of dominance. The Notari's flashback was perhaps the most haunting for Kethvar's growing sense of responsibility for what he had asked for. They described a fight in which a city beneath the sea was attacked by an unknown force. The humans entered not with torpedoes, but with a method of local empathy, a way of listening to the water itself, hearing the city's pressure lines, and the way its people's sorrow and fear rippled through the currents. They did not force a solution, but offered a language of compromise, a plan to preserve life while ensuring that the city would not be annihilated. In the Notari's memory, one moment stood out. A human chief, standing with a sphere of water around his hand, coaxed a frightened submarine to surface, and with a simple gesture, asked the city's defenders to lower their weapons and speak with him. The result was not a surrender, but a reimagining of how to defend a people against a common threat, without killing those who disagreed with the approach. In the days numbered by the council as important but not urgent, the human team began to present a more provocative demonstration, one that unsettled the room with its quiet, almost gentle menace. They released a sequence of strategic scenarios, cases of impossible conditions that could only be survived through fast improvisation, cross-species collaboration, and a willingness to let fear become a catalyst for new kinds of cooperation. They did not threaten the council with violence or with a weapon. Rather, they presented a path toward a future where no single species could survive on its own, not because interspecies reliance was the only viable option, but because it was the only durable way to manage a universe of unpredictable variables. And as they did, a thread of anxiety tugged at Kethvar again. an anxiety that the test might reveal not the humans' fearlessness but their own complicity in a more complex web of survival that did not require outer domination, but required inner transformation. Kethvar's decision to test the humans had begun with a single, arrogant assumption that the humans would fold under pressure, their primitive minds unable to sustain a long, layered negotiation. He had expected a spectacle of fear, a demonstration of a species that would cry out for mercy or reveal a crude desire to seize the moment with violence. He did not anticipate the subtle, patient, almost compassionate intelligence that the humans would bring to the table, nor did he anticipate the way their restraint would feel like a blade, precise and dangerous, even when sheathed. But as the week closed and the council prepared to unveil the test's formal threshold, something in Kethvar's own mind shifted. The sense of his own power, the power to declare a test, and then to press a lever that could destroy millions of lives with little delay, began to feel not as something that marked a victory, but as a kind of moral erosion. He watched the humans calm as they prepared their own response to the test, and he recognized in that calm a fear he had never allowed himself to confront. Fear of becoming what he despised. He had spent his life cultivating the image of the conqueror whose power would be absolute, whose enemies would be ground into the dust of inevitability, whose future would be written by the bullet and the blast. And in that moment, he saw the possibility that humans might not be a footnote in his story, but the hinge on which the story would turn. As the test's official threshold approached, the room held a collective breath that was almost a physical thing, a fog of expectation that hummed with possibility and dread. The council prepared to announce the challenge in a voice that could be heard by all, not to threaten, but to reveal. The humans prepared to respond not with bravado, but with a plan that would insist upon their own terms and their own sense of the future's governance. And Kethvar, for the first time in his life, realized that he might be standing at a doorway to a realm he could not simply conquer into compliance, but a realm he might have to learn to live in on terms he could understand only if he listened with his whole mind and not with his urge to command. The moment came in a chamber of quiet stars, where the air tasted of old iron and the future's cold breath. The council's chair spoke again, a soft, inexorable voice that bridged galaxies and ages. "The field test will proceed with a staged demonstration," Elira said, the weight of that sentence landing on the room as if someone had thrown a stone into a pond of still water. "We will begin with a scenario that requires rapid cross-species cooperation to avert a planetary disaster caused by a simulated collapse of multiple planetary authorities. Essentially, a war of information and survival, not a war of weapons." The lights shifted, and the chamber's walls showed a holographic map that shifted and redefined the space around them, turning it into a living tableau of a galaxy on the edge of a fracture. The humans' response was a chorus of practical words. The engineers announced a rapid, flexible network that could adapt to 100 unknowns in minutes, a system of decision-making that valued multiple voices and dissent as the necessary fuel for a credible plan. The diplomats described a framework for communication that could function across languages and cultures, with a speed and depth that would make normal negotiation look like slow drawing of a line in the sand. The scientists offered a suite of experiments to test every assumption that could pry open a vulnerability, only those vulnerabilities, never a weapon, to ensure that no one world would be allowed to dominate a future that would require the cooperation of all. Kethvar listened. He listened with a careful, almost clinical patience that hid his inner tremor. He did not attempt to interrupt. He did not attempt to drown the humans in a deluge of force or a show of power. Instead, he asked questions, questions that would reveal his proper respect for a species he had previously dismissed. He asked about the speed of adaptation, the limits of cooperation, the capacity to endure long negotiations without giving in to grievance. He asked about how a species that had suffered so much could still maintain a sense of hope that did not involve a line of slaughter. The answers came in the meetings and conversations that followed in the days before the test began in earnest. The humans explained how they had built a culture of negotiation that treated fear as a controllable variable rather than a weapon. They described their schooling, their institutions, the ways in which children were taught to identify one's own biases, and to reject them when the consequences of those biases could cost lives. They explained how their scientists built safety nets, redundant systems that would fail only after every other possible system had failed, ensuring that even in the case of a disaster, there would still be people who could salvage something of meaning from the wreckage. They spoke of empathy as a technology, a tool that could be learned and practiced as much as a calculus or a propulsion system. Kethvar's own mental map of the world began to tilt in ways that surprised him. He noticed that the humans did not idealize their fear, did not try to bury it under a rhetoric of superiority. They confronted fear, talked about it, and then used it to build better structures. They did not pretend to be unafraid or to be immune to pain. They admitted that pain existed and yet insisted on choosing a path that did not rely on dominating others. It was a strange, level-headed courage of a species that had never looked to expand outward to the stars as a means of proving itself, but only to survive with each other. Yet the test did not proceed by ignoring the truth of Kethvar's desire to see them bend to his will. The Warlord could feel the pull of something older than his ambition, the sense that if he allowed the test to become a mere demonstration of human resilience, he would be surrendering a piece of his own identity, a piece of the empire he had built from the bones of conquered worlds. The test, which promised to reveal something of the human mind's potential to outthink the universe, would also reveal the truth of his own vulnerability to a force he had long believed was beneath him. The quiet power of a people who could orchestrate outcomes not by fear, but by the patient, unglamorous work of building a better system. In the end, the field test unfolded not in a single dramatic moment of triumph or the sudden collapse of a world, but in a chain of small, carefully measured actions. The humans did not attempt to rain down a victory upon their adversaries, or to force a sudden surrender by the other parties. Instead, they built a pathway, a connective tissue of collaboration that brought together a chorus of voices, a web of alliances across the chamber's many species, and a plan that moved with a patient, almost glacial determination toward a future where no single mouth could dictate the terms of life for others. Kethvar watched as the field test began to take shape in the space before him, a space where the lines between friend and foe blurred, where the problem's solution would be a shared decision rather than a single act of conquest. It was a strange thing to witness. The moment when a warlord who had learned to see the world in terms of borders and battles began to glimpse a future in which those borders could be dissolved by the simple, stubborn will of people who refused to accept that fear should be their guide. The days of the test stretched on, each day bringing a different angle on the same central question. Could humanity, with all its imperfections and all the tabloid fears that surrounded them, hold a galaxy together in the face of a threat that was not only external but inner? The threat of cynicism, of arrogance, of the assumption that one could survive by destroying others rather than by building something that could outlive them all. And all the while, Kethvar felt the weight of his decision pressing down upon him with an inexorable gravity. He had chosen to test them because he believed a species could not be trusted to join the council without having their claim proven through a trial. But what he was now seeing was not a species of naive, reckless fighters. He was seeing a civilization that had learned to live inside of its fear without letting fear become the driver of its choices. He was seeing a species that could weave a future out of the threads of every threadbare fear, not by ignoring fear but by embracing it, studying it, and turning it into something useful. In those final days before the test's final moment, before the last subprogram of the demonstration would be activated, the room's atmosphere shifted into something closer to reverence, or at least something that resembled reverence in the sense that the participants recognized they were bearing witness to something that would alter the universe's sense of who could be trusted to stand in a room together and decide a future. The humans had not merely faced Kethvar's challenge. They had proven themselves as a species capable of something the Council had seldom seen. A silence that could hold an idea long enough for it to become a decision. A patience that allowed a group of diverse beings to treat their future as something held in common rather than something to be divided by force. Kethvar stood at the window of the chamber's outer hall, looking out across the starfield, his eyes tracing the faint lines of ships and satellites that cut through the cosmos like the marks of a handwriting that had not yet learned to inscribe a future that would endure beyond a single lifetime. He did not realize how much his own perception of humanity would be affected by what he would witness in that window, how his own fear would begin to shift into something else entirely, something that could be called regret, though he did not yet know to name it. The final moment arrived not with a bang, but with a quiet, almost imperceptible shift in the room's air, a moment in which the humans would present their plan for the final phase of the field test. They did not declare victory. They did not claim to have solved all the problems of the galaxy. They offered instead a framework, a durable architecture of governance, communication, and crisis response that would be scalable to any conflict, any environment, any species. They explained how, in their world, the greatest strength was not the weapon you held in your hand, but the network you could build with others, the willingness to listen and to adjust, the courage to admit error, and to revise a plan without the fear of losing face. They demonstrated, in a way that would echo through the annals of the Council, that a civilization could be strong without being cruel, could be brave without being reckless, could be powerful without necessitating the destruction of others. Kethvar's eyes, which had held the cold calculation of a man who believed the only path to survival was to win every encounter, began to see in the humans a different logic of power. The logic of power that requires a future to be built alongside others, not merely as a conquest, but as a shared project. He did not whisper his own thoughts to the room in that moment, for a warlord's pride is a chorus that does not easily stumble, but a part of him, a small engine of doubt, began to turn slowly, like a wheel that had long been stuck in mud, and had at last found a patch of slick ground that could carry it forward. As the test concluded, the last of the chamber's orbiting watchers, from the world where time feels older than memory, whispered into the ship's comms with a cautious awe, a tremor that suggested a new era's birth. They reported to their worlds in terms of an event that could be read as a turning point in the history of every species that watched. The humans had not merely demonstrated cunning. They had offered the universe a form of hope that did not depend on the annihilation of difference, but on the harnessing of difference into something that could serve the common good. Kethvar remained still for a long moment after the humans had finished their presentation, which had concluded with a quiet, stubborn invitation to the Council to join them in a shared commitment to a future that would require much more of them than the old ways would allow. He spoke then, not with the certainty that had carried him so far, but with a weight that suggested a man who stood at the edge of a cliff, and realized that the next step could be either a leap into the unknown or a plunge into a chasm that would swallow him. "I misread you," he said, his voice a careful instrument, a new tone that could be interpreted as either contrition or calculation. "I believed that your strength lay in the stubbornness of your survival instinct, in the speed with which you can adapt to a changing field of battle. I did not foresee that your strength would be your willingness to work together, to bind yourselves more tightly to one another than to any single ambition or fear. It is a humbling thing to learn that the thing you thought would be your instrument of power could become the instrument of your own restraint." The words, when spoken, shifted the chamber's atmosphere in a way that resembled weather changing over a world's horizon. The Zephyrians, the Vortani, the Nautari, and the other delegates, each one a world's worth of history compressed into a single body in this giant, luminous room, did not cheer or cry out. They did not erupt into triumph or surrender. They simply allowed the moment to pass across their senses like a tide, and offered a measured response that could be read in their eyes more clearly than in their mouths. The Zephyrian elder, with a consideration that reminded some of a judge listening to a child pleading for protection, spoke first. "Warlord," he teased with a wingbeat that sounded like wind through a hollow reed, "your test demanded we reveal our most vulnerable truths to one another. You have learned something, perhaps more than you intended. The question now is whether you will learn to unlearn the old habits that come with power and fear." The Vortani shifted their crystalline bodies, their facets catching and refracting the light into tiny, star-like points that hovered for a moment before settling into a calm stillness. A spokesperson, whose form seemed to be less a single creature and more a choir of voices, spoke with voices layered upon each other, like multiple tones singing in a single note. "If the test proves that fear can be managed, not by the suppression of others, but by the cultivation of mutual trust. Then we have learned to survive on a far more robust rung of the ladder than any conquest could offer. We will not declare victory or doom. We will declare a future that we can all inhabit if we choose to trust one another again. The Nautari's voice came next, and it was a soft, flowing sound, a language of water that seemed almost to move through the world's air rather than across it. We have heard the human plan. We have heard the approach that suggests a new kind of defense. That defense is not the ability to strike first, but the ability to adapt, to learn, to forgive. If the price of this new defense is the risk of a future we must share, then we will pay that price. And then Saren D. Hal, who had stood at the podium of diplomacy since the first moment the council had convened, who had learned to read the room with a patient, careful gaze, spoke the last words in a voice that carried the weight of someone who would be accused by history of naive trust or of dangerous optimism, depending on the reader's vantage. We do not know what will come of this, Warlord. We do not know if your people will honor the agreement if the stars themselves burn with need. But we know this. The future will demand that we look at fear not as an enemy to be crushed, but as a teacher whose lessons must be processed through a discipline of shared responsibility. If you choose to stay within the rules we now set forth, you will be granted a seat at the table, and the chance to be judged by your own choices, not by your capacity to inflict pain. Kethvar did not respond with the flourish of a victor's decree. He simply nodded, a gesture of acknowledgement that carried a heavier gravity than any boast. Then, with a sudden, almost impulsive grace, he stepped forward and extended his hand, not in a weapon's grip, but in a gesture that was both a warning and a request. The humans did not shrink back. They did not accept with fear, but they did not resist. They offered a simple human handshake, the form a symbol that had survived centuries of conflict, a ritual of mutual recognition that could, in a different universe, become the seed of lasting peace or a gateway to the oldest kind of fear. Betrayal. If one could label the moment, it would be labeled with something unusual in the annals of war and diplomacy. A moment of compromise so profound that even the most hardened of beings found themselves listening to the hush within the room's hallways, as if to catch the echo of a better future that might be born from this agreement. Kethvar's heart did not suddenly become soft, nor did his mind suddenly open to the possibility of mercy as a policy. He remained the creature of 1,000 worlds who had learned to live by a code of conquest. Yet his eyes carried a heavier burden now, a burden that would resurface in his sleep as a memory of fear, a memory of a person who had once believed that power was a finite resource that could be hoarded and displayed and never used again, a memory of a day when the most unexpected thing happened. The fear he had used to guide his steps began to erode. He realized, in a way that would take him years to understand, that power could be a mirror as well as a blade, and that the image reflected back in that mirror might not be what he expected. After the meeting, the corridors of the council's orbiting citadel were crowded with voices and lingering glances. The insects and crystalline beings moved with a more measured pace, as if the test had redirected their attention toward the future rather than toward old battles. The nurses of the medical wing, the archivists of the memory vault, the technicians who kept the orbital infrastructure humming, the entire network of life that sustained the council's deliberations, moved with a new breath in their lungs, a breath haunted by the possibility that humanity might not be the menace that rumor painted, but a force capable of reshaping the rules that had long governed interstellar diplomacy. In the days that followed, Kethvar's leadership began to rethink, in private, the choices he had made. He would not abandon his ambition to see his people thrive or to maintain their position among the galaxy's most powerful. Yet a part of him, a sector of his mind that had learned to distrust the fear that had fueled his campaigns, began to wonder if there might be a path toward survival that did not require the annihilation of all who stood opposite him. It was a dangerous line of thought, for to abandon the old ways was to risk losing the advantage of a lifetime, to risk becoming something other than the warlord they had spent so long shaping him into. And yet the more he watched the humans operate in their own quiet way, the more the seed of doubt grew. The council's decision, though not a betrayal to the test's intent, did something else as the days passed. It reframed the galaxy's understanding of what it meant to be dangerous. People who did not strike first could still alter the balance of power with a patience and a cunning that did not require a surprising outbreak of violence. The human's reputation was not merely that of survivors, but of strategists who could turn any situation to their advantage without the ordinary tools of fear. The rumor of humanity's terrifying capability persisted, but the narrative around that capability changed. It was not a narrative of crude force, but a narrative of a silent, disorienting intensity, an intensity that did not need to be loud to be deadly. Kethvar would come to realize that the true cost of his test was not the possibility that the humans would fail, but the possibility that they would reveal a kind of power to the cosmos that might be more far-reaching than conquest. It was a future where dominance would be replaced with durable, resilient cooperation, and where fear could be managed not by annihilation, but by disciplined, principled action that binds diverse species to a shared cause. And in those hours of reflection that followed, the warlord found his own sense of self-shifting, no longer as the solitary figure who moved from world to world with a blade in hand, but as a strategist who understood that the blade's edge could also be a tool for building a future where fear no longer defined the terms of life. The humans, for their part, did not celebrate. They kept their council attentive, their people ready for the next stage of the galaxy's unfolding. They did not declare victory, nor did they surrender. They simply prepared to be what they claimed to be, a civilization that believed in the possibility of a shared future built from diverse strengths and the honest, sometimes uncomfortable, admission that fear would continue to be a factor but not the sole determinant of policy. What happened next would be told and retold across worlds, a parable for days when fear and ambition collide. The warlord Kethvar would come to know that he had not merely tested humanity, but had become, in a certain sense, the subject of humanity's test as well. The test of whether a species could be measured by the force of its fear or by the strength of its restraint and its willingness to share leadership with others. It would take years for him to recognize this, and even then the recognition would be incomplete, for the universe remains larger than any one star and the future longer than any single lifetime. In the meanwhile, the galaxy's attention settled on the humans with a quiet, unsettled certainty. They had passed the test in a way that did not require a single explosion, a single officer to surrender, or a single planet to be conquered. They had passed by offering a future that would demand that all their neighbors, no longer seen as enemies but as potential partners, be included in the process of building a galaxy where fear could be faced with a calm, deliberate, and resolute heart. In the days to come, the Council would hold another meeting, and another, as though the galaxy's shape depended on the way they could talk to each other, not simply on their weapons. The humans would continue to speak and negotiate, to show their willingness to stand by their commitments, even if the new terms of their existence required them to grow beyond their earlier limitations. And the world would wait, as all worlds do, for the next signal, the next rumor, the next moment when the question would arise in someone's mind. Are humans truly the most terrifying force in the cosmos? Or have they become the cosmos' most persistent teachers, shaping fear into endurance and into a future that could be shared? Kethvar did not forget the quiet moment on the day the test's final phase began to take its shape in the minds of the galaxy. He would carry this memory, the memory of a room where the fear of humans became a new instrument of calm, the memory of a future that did not hinge on conquest. He would come to realize that the fear and the warning the others had given him were not about a people's capacity for harm alone, but about their capacity to transform even the most terrifying rumors into a path toward something new. And so, as the final echoes of that day faded into the long night of space, the galaxy braced for a future whose edges were no longer defined by the sharp line of a sword, but by the patient, careful architecture of a world in which humans could share a space with others without surrendering their own core identity. The warlord stood at the edge of the galaxy, as if to look into the distance where the next challenge would appear, and he knew there would be another challenge soon. He also knew that the challenge wouldn't come in the form of a blinding flash of a weapon or a single moment of domination. It would come as a slow, unrelenting insistence on truth-telling, on the hard work of collaboration, and on the stubborn, extraordinary belief that fear could become strength when tempered by trust and a willingness to learn. Thus began a new chapter in the annals of interstellar politics. A chapter in which a human reputation as terrifying was not a weapon to be wielded, but a standard to be met with, in which fear could be managed, and in which the galaxy's future could hinge not on the power to destroy, but on the choice to sustain life through collective care. And if the rumors had sometimes been cruel and misleading, they had nonetheless carried a grain of truth. Truth not about the simple nature of human warfare, but about a deeper truth. Humans have a way of turning any battlefield into a classroom, any victory into a lesson, and any fear into a map toward a future where the terrors of the unknown can be faced with a calm, certain, almost terrifying composure.